Yeah, I'll react to that, sure.
Early childhood and single payer and the like. I also know
America is not Europe. True.
I was born
Hoog. I'm subbed. Preemptive, like, link to the original video, top of the description. I don't really know what this is going to be about, but I'm curious. My name's Connor, if you're new. If I didn't already say that, let's learn.
and grew up in Denmark. I was born and grew up in Denmark. And these are countries where the government spends taxes and spends approximately twice the level of the United States. Mm-hmm. And while I am very sympathetic to many of your spending proposals, especially on the things you mentioned on early childhood and single payer and the like, I also know that these are countries that heavily tax everybody. Not just the rich people, middle classes, they have consumption taxes on everything of 20%. So while I'm very sympathetic to what you say, my sense is still that you would like to spend as a Scandinavian, but not tax as one. Is that correct?
We have, the answer is, and you raised some very good points.
Comparing the US with Europe and countries in...
Just wanted to say, when did Ted Cruz and Bernie Sanders have a debate together, just one-on-one? The only place I can see that is possible is in a general election. They were never a general election candidate. So is that just they just...
Europe.
Some very good points.
Comparing the US with Europe and countries in Europe would be naive, oversimplistic, and offend a bunch of people. Land masses are complex. But I'm going to go ahead and compare them anyways, because some of the comparisons between Europe and the US remain way too superficial.
Read my lips. No new taxes.
Liar.
It's not uncommon to obsess over the usual suspects for why the US is less equal than Europe and also has less good quality, affordable social programs. The analysis is simple. The US has more billionaires and taxes them less. Europe has less billionaires but taxes them more. Need a larger tax base to fund popular social programs and also less inequality, just raise the taxes on the rich, like the Europeans do. Now, although the tax rates for rich people explain some part of the difference, it doesn't explain enough. Europeans can afford good social programs because a lot of
over time here. Whoa. $19.80. 20% share of income in 1980 was the top 1%, and now it's down to almost 10. Well, that's a good thing, right?
it doesn't explain
I am not
enough.
smart.
It's for rich people explains some part of the difference. It doesn't explain enough. Europeans can afford good social programs because a lot of Europeans pay a lot for them, mainly through indirect taxes. And Europeans are also more equal before taxes even factored in because a lot of the social programs they pay more for also reduce pre-tax inequality. But the US has, so far, been unable to adopt the same. Why? Well, in part because taxing the wealthiest of society is easier to advertise and justify than taxing everybody a lot more. In Europe, most people don't really need to be convinced about paying for their welfare states because it works sufficiently for most of them. But in the US, there's an intimate struggle with deciding whether pre-distribution will be a state, local, or federal solution. Part of the reason is that in the US, the federal government gets the most media attention, while state and local governments can avoid scrutiny. This means that minimum wage hikes in the US are practically always seen as a responsibility for the federal government, which has to delicately balance different costs of living, like laborers living in New York City and miners living in West Virginia.
That was such a sassy downvote. She wasn't like, she's like, what was that?
Different costs of living, like laborers living in New York City and miners living in West Virginia. In Europe, though, a country like France or Denmark can opt for
I
different
have to shut my mouth. Come on. Okay, listening. I'm listening.
government, which has to delicately balance different costs of living, like laborers living in New York City and miners living in West Virginia. In Europe, though, a country like France or Denmark can opt for different geographically sensitive policy while also being held more directly into account because the assignment of responsibility is clearer to its citizens.
There's this definition of a wicked problem, which is circulating around in the literature, which suggests that a wicked problem is wicked if it has so many dimensions to it that you can't go at one angle to the problem and try to fix it. And I think school finance is like that. So school districts get money from their local communities in the form of property taxes. They'll also get money from the state, and the state might give them money through multiple formulas. And then a portion, a much smaller portion, about 9 or 10%, comes from the federal government. So even if you tried to solve the problem at, say, the state level, there are these other funding sources that come with their own restrictions, which ultimately affect how the money gets used in schools.
In Connecticut, a U.S. state, a school in Bridgeport will be poorer by virtue of being surrounded by poorer properties, while a school in Greenwich will be richer because it is surrounded by richer properties. This is because local taxes are largely funded by property values in the area. However, this concept fails to explain everything. Educational disparities also exist across Europe and within its countries. The US is not unique for having a system that predisposes poor children to poorer resources. Education systems are complex. Finland is not the same as Sweden, and resources invested in education and the quality that follows does not seem like a linear relationship. The US's unique situation is that its quality does not match the amount that the US actually spends on it. One of the problems with answering why resources don't match the quality you would expect in the US is because the decentralized nature of school districts makes it pretty difficult to actually identify what spending works and what doesn't. Overall, there are some indications that, compared with Europe, the amount of staffing, the associated health and retirement benefits, alongside transportation, all add up to more costs for the American education system. But the differences don't end there.
In the 1990s, as the crime rate was plummeting, as American life was getting safer and safer, Americans freaked out and thought that if they take their eyes off their children, the children will be abducted. Now, this goes back, the fear was stoked by cable TV in the 1980s. There were a few high-profile abductions. But it's not until the 1990s that we really start locking kids up and saying, you cannot be outside until you're 14 or 15. We took this essential period of childhood from about 8 to 12, when kids throughout history have practiced independence, have gotten into adventures, have made rafts and floated down the Mississippi River. We took that period and said, you don't get to practice independence until it's too late, until that period is over.
Kids in the US are raised differently than kids in Europe.
I'm just one person, so I'm hesitant of being like, that's not my experience. But I grew up in a pretty good neighborhood. I think most people would consider it a good neighborhood. I know it's sort of objective, calling something. But I definitely had a very kind of adventurous childhood. I wasn't next to the Mississippi, but definitely created a lot of cool stuff and have great memories from then. I know that doesn't apply to anyone, which is why it's just a personal anecdote, and I shouldn't have even started
Some
talking.
blame the planning that produced more isolated American families, some the over-paranoia towards kidnapping in the 1980s, and others point to an increasingly competitive environment where parents try to give their children an edge over the others by helicoptering them. It's really not that far a stretch to say that many European children could be considered to have more freedom at an earlier age. American children are less likely to be able to walk to school alone compared with European children, which you can of course connect to overall crime rates, and authoritative school policy is still much more accepted across the US than it is in Europe.
So, the real key to the distinctiveness of America is the structure of our government. One part of it, of course, is the independence of the judiciary. But there's a lot more. There are very few countries in the world, for example, that have a bicameral legislature. Oh, England has a House of Lords for the time being, but the House of Lords has no substantial power. They can just make the Commons pass a bill a second time. France has a Senate, it's honorific. Italy has a Senate, it's honorific. Very few countries have two separate bodies in the legislature equally powerful. That's a lot of trouble, as you gentlemen doubtless know, to get the same language through two different bodies elected in a different fashion. Very few countries in the world have a separately elected chief executive. Sometimes I go to Europe to talk about separation of powers. And when I get there, I find that all I'm talking about is independence of the judiciary. Because the Europeans Don't even try to divide the two political powers, the two political branches, the legislature and the chief executive. In all of the parliamentary countries, the chief executive is the creature of the legislature. There's never any disagreement between them and the prime minister, as there is sometimes between you and the president. When there's a disagreement, they just kick them out. They have a no confidence vote, a new election, and they get a prime minister who agrees with the legislature. And, the Europeans...
The difference is simple. European countries are mainly nations, not federations. A European state
with the legislature. And, the Europeans...
The difference is simple. European countries are mainly nations, not federations. A European state, if it existed, could never be the same as the U.S. Written in their constitution, U.S. states are modeled after the federal government, and state governments, which mirror the one above, usually have their own chamber of representatives, a senate, and also have an executive mirrored.
Right. So the governor is essentially the president of the state, right?
After their president. In Europe, if there was any state that was above the countries that made it up, it would have to be modeled from those very different countries beneath it, rather than serving as a model for the countries below it. This is an important difference because it means that any kind of European government would have to balance parliamentary systems with presidential republics, federal states with unitary ones, and they'll be expected to create a system that hopefully pleases each one sufficiently.
Yeah, the fact that the United States, made up of 50 states, were conceived, the original 13 of them, conceived, were already very similar, much more similar to each other than European countries are similar to each other even now, I would argue. But that they all kind of came from the same loincloth. And so that I feel like that is an enormous factor that goes to the stability of the country later on, even as it takes in additional states. You speak the same language. You all have, came from a British Empire based government. It was all very similar. You have similar traditions and thoughts. And I bring this up when I watch videos that talk about comparing the European Union to America, or just Europe as overall to America, in trying to form any more unified Europe, is that it's so much more difficult than America, in that you all came together rather than being born as one and then expanded as one, or relatively as one.
Expected to create a system that hopefully pleases each one sufficiently. All in all, although the differences between the two are practically endless and somewhere near impossible to actually describe, it's still a worthwhile effort to try and figure a few out and also discuss them. In some way, Europe has more breathing room to understand what it wants to be, which is no easy task, because whatever you think Europe is, it can still look across the Atlantic and realize what it definitely is not.
I really wish this was way longer. That seemed like it was 2 minutes long. It was 9 minutes. It just shows you how it was a great video. But I would love if this was like a 45-minute video, I wouldn't have minded. Things I left out, it was too lazy to figure out how to animate. Fair. Still a great video. Yeah, I'd love it if he made a... So, really interesting. I had noticed this. I'm not nearly as knowledgeable as he... Who is this? Scalia, right? He's dead, but he was a Supreme Court judge. I definitely noticed that when learning about the UK, in that your prime minister seems to be much more of just an elected spokesman for the main party in parliament, whatever party is the main party at that time. Yeah, it seems where America is, they're elected, the big election of the year. A lot of people obviously vote in the senatorial election, in all the different elections, but the big one is the American election. So the fact that you have this whole different process that has nothing to do with the constituents, the elected representatives that are already there, they don't choose who you are. You're just elected like they were elected, right? And so there's going to be that separation, even without considering the built-in separation of powers that's Scalia mentioned. Yeah, there's things that I like about that. I would like to have both, but you can't have both because the difference is the result of the fact that they're different. I would like to have both that, I saw examples of prime ministers that after they were done being prime minister, they went back to their position that they had before that. That might seem not strange to you guys, but to me, I was like, wait, what? I'm like, wait, there's so little protection. There's compared to the president, there's so little. I feel like when you are the president, when you become the president, that is your last thing. The rest of your life, you are a post-president. You're a former president. Like that. The idea of a president later after he's out of office goes back to his Senate position or whatever he was before then, if he was a senator or whatever. That learning about word vomit. After learning about that of prime ministers doing that, going back to their role in the House of Commons, I was like, whoa, wait, what? Oh, wait, that makes sense. And so it just seems like you kind of just, you pick a spokesperson. Like that's what the prime minister is. And if you don't like him anymore, vote of no confidence, he or she is taken down. And I like that about it. I want to say it seems like there is way too much of a aura around the president of the United States, that he's this. I'm not good at words right now. I think you get what I mean. So I like that part, but I also like the idea of people voting for the president rather than people like, say, senators or people in the House of Representatives choosing the president every time. I don't like that idea, but I like the idea of that it's less of a praised position, right? It's just, yeah, like, you're the prime minister. Great. Good for you. Do this, 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 and that. Oh, you're not? Well, vote of no confidence. You're out. Whereas the president can say, F you, he can say, no, I'm doing this. And so there are parts of both that I like, but they're mutually exclusive, it seems. And I can't have both the feeling that you guys have around your prime minister, but the separateness that we have our president. So I wish I could have pieces of both. You can't. Another thing you said that was really interesting is the well, actually, first, the House of Lords. I the more I learn about the House of Lords, the more I don't like giving. You should do with your country what you want to do. Whatever I think doesn't matter. Okay, I kind of think the same. People outside the U.S. talking about the U.S. Yeah, it's fine, but at the end of the day, we're gonna choose, as any country should. And I don't know. Yeah, like, stuff can get through. Let me say this: stuff can get through much more easily if you don't have our system. But I do like our system. I like our system for the same way I don't like it, is that it's difficult to get stuff passed. I don't think you want to go too crazy and just someone has the ability in government to just pass a bunch of things when they get in power, because then it'll just be, oh, when they get out, it'll be a giant swap. And every time you get a Democrat or Republican or someone changing, the country's going to have this giant swing. And I'm sure that's not going to be very, very healthy. And so I don't know a lot of stuff about this. I love learning about it. Really interesting. I'm going to stop it here. Again, I would love it if this was like 5 times as long. I hope you guys are doing well. I hope I made a little sense, or you guys could at least infer enough to where you can comment on what I said, or yeah, I'd really appreciate any comments. Hope you guys are doing well. I love topics like this so much. It's fascinating to me. Stuff I don't know a lot about, but I really want to know more. So that's it for now. Hope you guys are doing well. I'll see you next video. Bye, guys.